What would you do if the people who destroyed your sanctuary were suddenly trapped in a disaster of their own making? One night, as rain pounded against my window, my phone buzzed with frantic messages. Water was rising, basements were flooding, and streets had turned into rivers. The very people who forced me to destroy my peaceful backyard creek were now watching their own homes sink into the mess they had created. How did it come to this? Could it have been prevented? Before all this chaos, before the HOA's overreach, before the storm proved their arrogance wrong, I had a peaceful creek running through my backyard. It was a place of serenity, a small piece of nature where birds sang and children played. But one day, everything changed. A new Homeowners Association, HOA, a governing body that enforces rules and regulations in planned communities, took control and declared my beloved creek a hazard. They gave me an ultimatum: drain it or face severe fines. What happened next turned my quiet life into a battle I never expected to fight. Before we dive into this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe if you enjoy stories about justice, standing up for what's right, and nature proving its power. Now, let's begin. That's exactly what happened to me. My name is Jake Anderson, and I had lived in my home in Willow Creek Heights for over a decade, enjoying the serenity of my backyard creek. But everything changed when a newly expanded Maplewood HOA took over our neighborhood and set their sights on my land. One peaceful afternoon, I checked my mailbox and found a thick envelope stamped with a Maplewood HOA logo. Confused, I tore it open and read the notice inside. Our neighborhood, once free of any governing body, had now been absorbed into the Maplewood HOA's jurisdiction. Accompanying the notice was an exhaustive list of rules, strict architectural guidelines, and a demand that I sign a legally binding agreement to abide by their policies. Skimming through the dense text, I felt an immediate sense of unease. HOAs are notorious for their rigid rules, often micromanaging homeowners on everything from mailbox styles to holiday decorations. Many Americans see them as overbearing organizations that strip away personal freedom under the guise of maintaining property values. The document contained clauses about lawn maintenance, house paint colors, mailbox styles, and even the types of plants we were allowed to have in our yards. But what shocked me the most was a specific section titled Unapproved Water Features. My creek, my sanctuary, was apparently now classified as a liability, and unless I complied with their demands, I'd face hefty fines. I decided to ignore the letter, assuming it was just another case of unnecessary bureaucracy, something many Americans have learned to expect when dealing with HOAs or government overreach. I figured if I ignored it long enough, it would go away like most pointless regulations do. But just 3 days later, a sharp knock on my door signaled otherwise. Standing there in a crisp blazer, clutching a clipboard, was Karen Whitmore, the self-proclaimed Community Standards Director. Her smile was tight and artificial as she introduced herself. "Mr. Anderson, I noticed you haven't returned your HOA compliance agreement." "I don't plan to," I replied firmly. "This HOA takeover wasn't something I agreed to, and I'm not interested in being part of it." Karen's smile didn't waver. "I'm afraid you don't have a choice," she said, flipping through her paperwork. According to the neighborhood charter, if 75% of homeowners vote in favor of joining, the remaining residents are automatically enrolled. And as it turns out, we met that threshold. I frowned. "That can't be legal." "Oh, it's perfectly legal," she assured me. "And on another matter, we need to address the unapproved water feature on your property." I crossed my arms. "You mean the natural creek? The one that's been here longer than any of us?" Karen nodded. "Natural or not, it's still an unfenced water feature, which poses a safety hazard to children. The HOA requires you to either install a 6-foot barrier around it or drain it completely within 30 days. My frustration boiled over. That creek is barely ankle deep. The neighborhood kids love playing there, and their parents are fine with it. Karen's eyes narrowed. "Then I hope those parents have liability insurance, because if a child gets injured on your property, the legal responsibility falls on you. You know how things work here. One accident, and you could be facing a lawsuit that drains your savings." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. At the next HOA meeting, Karen and her husband Richard, the HOA president, stood at the front of the room, laying out their vision for our community. Richard droned on about property value protection and community uniformity, but I was only waiting for the inevitable mention of my creek. And sure enough, a few slides into their presentation, Karen clicked to an image of my backyard. Moving on to safety concerns, she announced, "This unauthorized water feature presents a drowning risk." I shot to my feet. That's not a water feature. It's a creek that's been here for decades. Karen gave me a patronizing smile. Regardless, all water features must be fenced or removed per HOA regulations. You have 30 days to comply, Mr. Anderson. Otherwise, fines will be issued. I clenched my fists as a wave of frustration washed over me. This wasn't about safety. It was about control. Around me, murmurs spread through the room. Some neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. Others whispered in hushed voices. A few nodded in agreement, clearly skeptical of the HOA's claims. One older man in the back shook his head, his arms crossed tightly. The tension was thick, and I could feel the tide beginning to shift. And I wasn't about to let them win. Frustrated and suspicious, I decided to do some investigating. The HOA's sudden aggression toward my creek didn't sit right with me, and I had a gut feeling there was more to the story. Armed with a flashlight and a camera, I followed the creek upstream late one evening. My journey took me past the tree line, where the water continued to flow from the newer development, the very neighborhood where Karen and Richard lived in their massive house. That's when I saw it. A hidden drainage pipe, half buried in cattails, discreetly funneling water from their development straight into my property. My heart pounded. This wasn't just a natural creek. It was an intentional water diversion system. And then, as if the universe wanted to confirm my suspicions, I spotted movement near the retention pond. I ducked behind a tree and watched in horror as Richard arrived in his golf cart, carrying a large plastic container. He looked around nervously before pouring a murky substance into the pond, the same pond that fed my creek. The sickly sheen of chemicals spread across the water, and within moments, small fish began floating belly up to the surface. I took rapid-fire photos, documenting every damning detail. My blood boiled, but as I snapped each picture, a wave of nervous energy coursed through me. What if Richard caught me? What if the HOA found out I was snooping around? I crouched lower behind the brush, my heart pounding as I considered the risks. If they were willing to poison the water, what else were they capable of? For a split second, I hesitated, but then I reminded myself this wasn't just about me. It was about the entire neighborhood, about the families who trusted me to fight back. I tightened my grip on my phone and took more photos. No matter the risk, the truth had to come out. This had nothing to do with safety or regulations. It was about covering up their own wrongdoing. Determined to fight back, I sought help from Dr. Laura Martinez, a renowned environmental expert. I showed her my photos, and she examined the creek with scientific precision, collecting soil and water samples. After conducting tests, she confirmed my worst fears. This creek is part of a crucial drainage system, she explained, pointing to topographical maps. If it's disrupted, the water will have to go somewhere else. And based on this development's location, it won't be pretty. That night, as I reviewed my findings, I knew one thing for certain. If the HOA insisted on destroying my creek, they were about to unleash a disaster on themselves. Despite my protests and expert testimony, the HOA hired contractors to fill in my creek, diverting the water underground. As I stood watching them destroy my sanctuary, I couldn't help but wonder, where would all that water go now? For days, I watched the dried creek bed with a heavy heart. The minnows and frogs that once thrived there had disappeared, leaving behind only cracked earth and scattered stones. The tranquility I had cherished was gone, replaced with an eerie silence that settled over my backyard. I knew nature wouldn't take this change lightly. 3 days later, an ominous storm rolled in. The sky darkened with thick clouds, and the air hung heavy with the scent of rain. By nightfall, the wind howled through the neighborhood, rattling windows and bending trees. When the rain finally came, it arrived in torrential sheets, hammering against roofs and flooding gutters in mere minutes. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows as the storm raged on. Rain hammered against the roof, creating a steady, deafening rhythm. Something fell off, the kind of eerie silence between thunderclaps that made my skin crawl. Then, just as I was drifting back into uneasy sleep, a sudden, frantic pounding on my front door jolted me awake. My neighbor Elaine stood outside, drenched from head to toe, her eyes wide with panic. "You need to see this," she gasped, pulling me into the storm. The streets had become rivers. Water bubbled up from storm drains like miniature geysers, pooling at intersections and sweeping away trash cans. I followed Elaine through the downpour, my heart racing as we turned onto Maple Drive, the street where Karen and Richard lived. It was a disaster zone. The manicured lawns of the HOA board members had turned into swamps, their pristine flower beds drowning beneath inches of standing water. Homeowners scrambled to block their doors with sandbags, but it was a losing battle. Several basements were already submerged, the water rising steadily inside homes. A few residents waded through their driveways, desperately trying to clear clogged storm drains with rakes and buckets. But the force of the flood was relentless. And at the center of it all, standing on her porch in a sopping wet designer robe, was Karen. Her face was twisted with disbelief as she yelled into her phone, undoubtedly demanding emergency assistance. Richard stood beside her, gripping a useless broom, trying to sweep water away from their front steps. This is impossible," Karen sputtered when she saw me. "How is this happening?" I crossed my arms, barely suppressing my satisfaction. "You took away the creek's natural drainage path. The water had to go somewhere." She opened her mouth to argue, but before she could, the foundation of a nearby house groaned loudly. A sickening crack echoed through the storm as the earth beneath it shifted. A rush of muddy water surged down the slope, carving deep trenches into the now saturated ground. Homeowners screamed as portions of their yards collapsed, dragging flower beds and retaining walls into the rising flood. Lightning illuminated the chaos for a split second, revealing the full scale of the destruction. Cars were half submerged, the streets were impassable, and the once pristine HOA neighborhood was being swallowed by the very forces they had tried to control. Karen stumbled back, horror dawning on her face. "What do we do?" she whispered, looking at me as if I held the answer. I shrugged. "Maybe you should have left the creek alone." The next morning, the damage was undeniable. The once pristine neighborhood had been transformed into a disaster zone. Waterlogged furniture, ruined heirlooms, and soggy insulation lined the curbs as homeowners frantically tried to salvage what little they could. The air smelled of damp wood and mildew. An exhausted family shuffled between their homes and the streets, shaking their heads in disbelief. Basements were flooded, foundations were cracking, and insurance companies were refusing to cover the damage, citing unmapped flood zones. Homeowners pleaded for help, but the insurance adjusters stood firm. This was an act of negligence, one adjuster stated, pointing to the evidence of water diversion. "Your HOA caused this, not nature." Panic turned into outrage, and by the afternoon, an emergency HOA meeting was called. The community center was packed to capacity, filled with homeowners who had finally had enough. Karen and Richard sat at the front table, looking drained and disheveled. Karen's usually perfect hair was damp and frizzy, her sharp, tailored outfit replaced with a wrinkled blouse that still bore signs of the morning's chaos. Richard's suit was rumpled, and for the first time, his confident posture was gone. He slumped in his chair, eyes darting nervously across the angry crowd. Just days ago, they had commanded these meetings with arrogance and control. Now, they looked like people who had lost everything, trapped under the weight of the disaster they had created. I walked to the front of the room, my hands gripping a stack of documents. "These," I said, my voice cutting through the angry murmurs, "are the original geological reports. They prove that this neighborhood was built on former wetlands, and my creek was a vital drainage point." The room erupted in shouts. One homeowner stood up, waving a water-damaged family photo. "We trusted you to protect our homes, and you ignored the warnings." Another resident added, We've lost everything, and you're still sitting here making excuses? The HOA board tried to shift the blame. This is a city issue. We had no way of knowing. Richard insisted, but I held up the email chain that proved otherwise. You knew exactly what you were doing, I countered. And now, the entire neighborhood is paying the price. The anger in the room reached a boiling point. Neighbors who had once remained silent now demanded justice. A petition to remove the HOA leadership was passed around, gaining signatures at lightning speed. Within minutes, the threshold was met. A vote was held that very night, and in a unanimous decision, Karen, Richard, and the rest of the corrupt board members were ousted. Karen's face was pale as she stood to leave. "This isn't over," she muttered under her breath, her voice laced with barely concealed anger. She exchanged a brief but pointed glance with Richard, whose jaw tightened as he surveyed the room. A hush fell over the crowd, and a few residents shot each other uneasy glances. A murmur rippled through the group. Was this a threat? Was she planning something? The thought sent a chill down my spine. But as Karen turned and strode out the door, the eruption of cheers and applause drowned out any lingering doubt. Whatever she had in mind, the community had already made their choice. But judging by the cheers that followed her exit, it certainly was. With the corrupt board gone, the new leadership immediately reversed the creek decision. A restoration project was launched to return the natural water flow, and for the first time in years, the community worked together for a common cause. It wasn't easy. The land had been scarred by the HOA's reckless interference, and restoring it to its natural state required both effort and patience. Volunteers gathered every weekend to remove debris, clear the diverted channels, and reintroduce native plants that had been uprooted. Environmental experts, including Dr. Martinez, guided us through the process, ensuring the creek would once again function as nature intended. Slowly but surely, life returned. Small rivulets of water trickled down the newly dug channels, reconnecting with the main stream. The first time I saw minnows darting between the rocks again, I knew we had succeeded. The local wildlife, herons, frogs, dragonflies, began to return, reclaiming their rightful habitat. Months later, I sat by my newly restored creek, watching the sun dance off the water surface. Birds chirped overhead, their songs blending with the soft murmuring of the creek. Children ran along the banks, dipping their hands into the cool water, their laughter filling the air like it always had before the HOA's disastrous intervention. The HOA had learned a harsh lesson. You can't fight nature, because nature always wins. But more than that, the community had learned something valuable too. We had discovered that by standing together, by fighting against corruption and greed, we could reclaim not just our land, but our sense of unity and purpose. And as I watched the gentle ripples in the water, I realized that this creek was more than just a stream. It was a symbol, a reminder that no matter how powerful those in control may seem, nature and truth will always find a way to break through. Lessons learned from this story. This story teaches us that nature cannot be controlled or ignored. It always finds a way. The HOA believed they could alter the natural landscape without consequences, but in the end, their actions backfired. It's a reminder that we must respect and work with nature, not against it. Additionally, it highlights the power of community unity. When people stand together against injustice, they can bring about real change. Meaningful message. Beyond being a fight against an unfair HOA, this story speaks to the larger issue of power and greed. Too often, people in positions of authority make decisions that benefit themselves while harming others. However, the truth will always come to light, and those who abuse their power will eventually face the consequences of their actions. It's also a powerful reminder that standing up for what's right, even when the odds seem stacked against you, can lead to victory. Personal perspective. To me, this story is about resilience and justice. It's frustrating to see people with influence make selfish decisions at the expense of others, but it's also inspiring to witness an individual take a stand and fight back. The moment the community came together to hold the HOA accountable was the true turning point. proving that collective action can bring down even the most stubborn forms of corruption. If you love stories about justice, resilience, and standing up against corruption, make sure to follow and subscribe to Story Precious. We bring you real and thought-provoking stories that inspire and entertain. Hit that subscribe button now so you never miss our latest videos.